Hello everyone, good afternoon and welcome to another live stream from Montfort University. Good afternoon if you are joining us here on Facebook. Good afternoon if you're joining with us on YouTube. Hello everybody. If you are watching on YouTube and Facebook, do drop us a little comment, let us know you're there, say hello, give us a little wave, interact with us in the chat. It's always nice to know that people are watching our live streams when we do things like this. My name's Ben and I work in part of the marketing team at Montfort University, and today we are going to be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on society, and we're going to be joined very, very shortly by academics from across the university to talk about the impact of the virus on various different respective fields that have that impact to students and have that impact across society. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see exactly their sort of perspectives on how the virus is having that impact on those respective fields. Hello to Sarah and hello to Amit, who have joined us on Facebook. Good to know that you're here and you're watching. I can see a few people are joining us in, quite a few people joining us on YouTube, which is fantastic as well. So hello to everyone. So yes, today's live stream is going to be talking about all of those things COVID-19, and it's going to be absolutely fantastic to get those perspectives from just some of our fantastic academics that teach a couple of different courses here at Montfort University. So thank you very much for joining us. Hopefully you will find this very, very interesting and very informative. Hello to Molly as well, who's also joined us on the comments as well. Good stuff. It looks like we're all raring to go. So, yes, as I say, today we're joined by 4 academics from across the university to discuss what the future may hold in a post-coronavirus society. And I'd like to introduce you to those academics now. So first of all, I would like to introduce you to an academic from our Health and Life Sciences department. We've got Maitreyi, who's going to be joining us in just a second. Hello, good afternoon.
Hi, Ben. Hi, everyone. I'm Maitreyi Shivkumar, and I'm a lecturer in the School of Pharmacy. So I teach microbiology and immunology, virology to pharmacy students and pharmaceutical and cosmetic science students. My background has been in virology, so I'm really interested in viruses, which is a great, great advantage right now. But it's something that I'm researching as well, but I really enjoy teaching immunology and microbiology as well. So if you have any questions particularly about those topics, I'm happy to try and answer them.
Fantastic. And I look forward to finding out a little bit more about that later on. And it sounds like, again, it's quite relevant to the current global situation, what you're looking at.
Yes, definitely.
Absolutely. So we'll come back to you in just a few moments just to find out a little bit more about that. The second person that I would like to introduce you to on this live stream is one of our academics from the Art and Design and Humanities department here at the university. I'd like to introduce you to Ruth. Hi, Ruth.
Hello. Hi. Hi, everyone. My name is Ruth Jindal, and I teach in the School of Art and Design and Humanities. And my area is really looking at the context for design. I teach in fashion, I teach in product design, I teach in craft. I'm part of a team called Design Cultures. And what we do is we look at both the history and contemporary issues of design and think about ways that you can incorporate those ideas into your studies.
That's fantastic. And I think that's had a real impact on quite a few different, the virus, I should say, has had a huge impact on quite a lot of different industries at the moment. So it'd be amazing to hear that from yourself. Yeah, it'd be really, really good to hear from yourself a little bit later. Next up on my list of stars here on this live stream, we've got Denise Johnson from the Business and Law faculty. Hello, Denise.
Hi, good afternoon. It's great to be here, being called a star. I've been locked inside for 2.5 months. It's great to have compliments. So I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Business and Law. Specifically, I'm in the Department of Management and Entrepreneurship. So I participate in sort of the 3 missions of the university, which is teaching and learning, which is very much of interest to you guys. Much like my colleagues from the other faculties have gone before me, my research and teaching is driven by my research rather. So I teach on modules that are closely linked and design brand new modules that are closely linked to my research on corporate entrepreneurship and innovation. I could talk to you about that a little bit more later. Leadership and creators' perspectives on entrepreneurial leadership and how you lead in unusual contexts. And I teach on entrepreneurial decision-making and strategic decision-making as well. My research also generates some findings that I'm able to translate into the third mission, which is sort of income generation and enterprise for the university. So I fall loosely in the category of, I guess, academic entrepreneur a little bit as well.
Amazing. And for students that are going to be maybe falling into that category, interested in following suit, I think the impact of this virus is going to be of particular interest at this stage as well. So it'll be good to come back and talk about that a little bit later as well. So thank you very much, Denisha. Last but certainly not least on, again, my star-studded live stream this afternoon, we have got John, who is joining us from the Computing Engineering and Media Faculty. Hello, John.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Dr. John Cow. I'm an associate professor in electronic engineering with a background, industrial background as a senior design engineer. I came into academia and my focus is really on delivering modules in the electronics area, which focus very much on practical skills, on making electronic systems actually work in practice, to design and build them and see a result from that. I work with other colleagues within the school, so I'm quite happy to field questions in other disciplines such as aeronautical engineering and mechanical engineering, which is also offered by our school, which is the School of Engineering and Sustainable Development.
Perfect. Thank you very much, John. And again, the impact that the virus has had, we're going to be coming back and talk to you a little bit later. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens over the next few months across all disciplines, just to see how that kind of impact carries on as we move forward. So I'm going to bring everybody back in so that we can start fielding some of our questions to the teams here at the university. So thank you very much for joining us on the live stream this afternoon, everyone. And thank you for everybody that's commented and said hello. We've had Evelyn, Ricardo, Rachel. Yeah, Rachel's apparently they're transferring fabric. So we've got daughter doing fashion, which is going to be really interesting. So somebody's sharing. Our live streams are bringing people together and sharing resources, which is absolutely fantastic. So hello to everyone. Hopefully over the next sort of 40 minutes to an hour, we're going to be able to give you lots and lots of information about that. So obviously, as months have gone on, we know that coronavirus has impacted all parts of modern life, and it's been a very interesting and somewhat difficult transition into sort of normal ways of life. I mean, as you can see, we're doing what would normally be maybe a face-to-face conversation or things like digital. A lot of our open days are moving to a digital sort of format. We're doing things like this. We're doing these sort of live streams. So it's good to start to see where the virus has also impacted on other areas of industry, other areas of expertise, other areas of fields. So that's why we've got these academics to sort of talk about this and talk about their sort of professional interest and their professional expertise and find out a little bit more how it's going to impact on those particular areas, particularly if you are either a current student or going into university, how that's going to maybe affect things like the job market and how the industries are going to look in the future. So what I would like to do, I think, is go over to Maitreyi first of all and talk a little bit about what the impact of the virus is having on something like the pharmaceutical industry, which is obviously already quite embedded in the sort of research side of the virus. So I'm going to head over to Maitreyi first of all to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting question. So obviously the pharmaceutical industry has really tried to gear up for trying to produce therapies, trying to produce vaccines against COVID-19, because before December we didn't even know that the virus existed. We didn't know about the virus. So the pharmaceutical industry really has had to step up to try and understand more about the virus, to try and see what we can do to block it. So one of the things that I think that has changed for the positive that I've seen as a researcher is that people are a lot more open with their work. So open source work is becoming much more common. People are collaborating a lot more, researchers in the pharmaceutical industry, to try and really understand what's going on and try and develop drugs or vaccines against the virus. So that's the major sort of change that has happened that I've seen with my research and my interactions with the pharmaceutical industry. And thinking about how the pharmaceutical industry generally works, it takes anywhere between, sort of 5 to 10 years to get from testing a compound for its activity and then it getting licensed into a drug or a vaccine. So what we've seen is now things are working a lot faster because we've really had to kind of try and come up with, therapies against the virus, because there is none at the moment. So that's something that definitely has changed, and that I've seen it working that way. And I think the pharmaceutical industry really has kind of embraced this open access system, which is beneficial to the whole of society.
Michelle, how have you found that this has sort of impacted on your particular sort of specialist area then, in terms of the things that you've looked at and the research that you've done more specifically?
Yeah, so in terms of my research, as I said, I'm a virologist, so I was quite well placed for this, for sort of turning to looking at this virus. In the past, I've worked with lots of different viruses like dengue and HIV, also herpes simplex, and norovirus, which is the stomach bug virus. So when this came up, this was something that I was very keen to get involved in, and we have started doing some work with coronavirus in DMU to try and test some compounds to develop antivirals. So we've very quickly switched, converted the labs in order to be able to do this work, which I think is very exciting, because it's something that that hopefully can contribute to getting a drug out and getting something that can help people infected with the virus.
That's amazing, and that's some of our current students that have been able to get involved with that as well.
Yeah, definitely. So it's so I currently have some master students who are doing projects, not in the lab, because obviously we're still social distancing and still staying at home at the moment with the campus being closed. But they're doing literature projects to do with coronavirus, because there's so much information that's out there and coming out, because we don't know so much about it. So that's something that my current master students are actually working on. That's
fantastic. That sounds amazing. We've had a question coming from Amit actually, regarding sort of medicine supply chains. He said, what impact would the virus have on sort of medicine supply chains? Is this something that you could sort of tackle?
Yeah, I'll be honest, I'm not entirely in the know for this, but from what I've heard from my pharmacy colleagues is that it has had an impact, obviously, with supplies coming in from India and from China, because generally that's where a lot of the generics are produced very cheaply, and that supply chain definitely has been impacted. There's a lot of pharmacy colleagues of mine who have gone back to pharmacies and working at the front line there, as well as current students who have gone back to volunteer at their local pharmacies. And I think that's something that is, their training at DMU has really helped them to get to that point and contribute back into society. And they have definitely seen, medicines not being supplied to the pharmacy at the same rate that they were before. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that insight. So again, as you can see there, obviously that's just one particular field of expertise that is obviously contributing to this virus in one specific way, and then obviously it's having that impact in others. So it's good to hear from you, and we'll obviously come back to you again very, very shortly to talk a little bit more about that. So thank you so much. Next up on the agenda, so first of all we've looked at the pharmaceutical industry. Tying into that, some of our other students that have been able to sort of support in another way. Some of our fashion design students and technicians have been helping to create PPE to help the NHS staff, which has been absolutely fantastic. Ruth, I'd like to bring you in to talk a little bit about the sort of fashion design industry for this particular section. So from utilising skills, how has coronavirus sort of affected your particular area?
Well, what we've seen is that designers, students ranging from school and colleges to universities, have all been able to use these key design skills of ingenuity and resourcefulness in order to be able to use what they've learned to apply that to being able to create this PPE. And it has, as you said, been fantastic. It's not just fashion students and staff, it's also within product design, where in a very similar way to my colleague, there's been a huge amount of open source collaboration whereby patterns for visors and masks, as well as scrubs, have been able to be shared among people who can create them, just to make sure that they are ones that are suitable. There was always the risk that people might be very keen to make these things and that they wouldn't be made of the right materials. So very early on in March, there was a whole approach to ensure that they were compatible. For a subject area like design with a very high level of practice, designers, I think one of the biggest impacts for us has been that designers have been very quick to adapt to working online. And this has opened the industry up to many people who otherwise wouldn't have access to it. So it's going to be a very interesting thing to see how this plays out. So, for example, at this time of year, we would be expecting our graduating students to be showing their work in person at Graduate Fashion Week or New Designers. And clearly, because of COVID-19, that hasn't happened. What has happened is the industry has stepped in with real support for emerging designers. And for example, Show Studio is hosting competitions for fashion students to show their work. And the online design magazine, Design, has held not only an online platform for graduating students, but also a month-long online design festival. And this willingness to engage with students, I think, is something that we welcome hugely. And the third thing I'd like to say is that we've seen more traction for design that's sustainable, both economically and environmentally. At DMU, we incorporate sustainability into all areas of our teaching. And we've seen that there's been a raised concern around product life cycles. It's important who makes our clothes, how products are manufactured, and how long they last, and how they can be recycled.
That's really good to hear. So really the students, particularly at DMU, have obviously they've had the sort of physical element taken away, which has been a real struggle, but obviously they're quite creative and they've adapted quite well to an online platform, which sounds really fantastic. Yeah. So in a follow-up question to that then, so in this sort of time of crisis, how have the big players of the sort of design and fashion and product industries sort of adapted to the current situation? And I know that Amit has also submitted a question asking for your thoughts on the British clothing manufacturing industry in the aftermath of this pandemic.
Amit, I'll take your question first. It's a great question, and it's the British clothing industry is one that is in the middle of a resurgence. We have, for example, community clothing, which is run by Patrick from the Sewing Bee. I don't know if you watch that. And this is all about using the immense skills we have in this country around around manufacturing and being able to promote those. It tends actually to be a kind of luxury fabric. I don't know if you'd agree with that. I'd be interesting to know what you think. And there's the British Fashion Council and Walpole Luxury do a lot to promote these both at home and in global markets. I think there is a place for handmade, good quality garments, and I think that's going to grow without a doubt. We're going to see people who are looking for quality and more local manufacturing. Ben, back to your question about what the big hitters are doing. We've seen the big fashion brands take the lead in pivoting their production from fashion and beauty into healthcare and well-being, and it's been hugely impressive. And it's been an action that they did very quickly. So there are some criticisms that some of it's done for show, but the big brands were very quick to move their production. And I think there's this kind of sincerity and authenticity that's grown as a result of that. The fashion weeks in Paris and Milan have been scrapped, and instead, if I can give you an example of London Fashion Week, they're going digital, fully digital. But in a move that I think is very interesting, they're merging menswear and womenswear fashion weeks, and for one gender-neutral week. And there's a recognition that all levels of business would be disrupted, and it's trying to maintain the global impact to let people know that once this pandemic is over, that everyone's ready to move ahead. For guys listening, that's going to take place between the 12th and the 14th of June, so that's just in a couple of weeks' time. And importantly, it's going to be open across digital platforms to everybody. And I think this opening up of the industry is something that we welcome. And I think for potential students, it's going to be a great way to see how the fashion weeks work and to think of some interesting contemporary perspectives around that. For architects and designers, what we're seeing is interventions where designers can think about the environment that we're going to be easing into in terms of social distancing and safety. There's research into materials and ways that we can ease back into a more normal life after lockdown. And related to this, thirdly, just like to say that the other end from the big hitters, the big brands, there's also the high street retail environment, which will in just a couple of weeks' time be looking at ways to increase footfall, to open up safely for business. And I think what we'll find is that many customers have got quite used to shopping online, and will be asking for quite a lot more from the high street, and we expect people to start shopping according to a slightly adjusted set of values relating to the environment and manufacturing conditions, as I mentioned earlier, but also to not lose that connection and loyalty to the way of shopping on lockdown. Thank you.
Absolutely. No, that was absolutely fantastic. And I think thinking about the big hitters, I almost didn't even consider actually the footfall for stores and that sort of thing does have that impact as well. Something else that Amit is commented on was regards to sort of a place for sort of handcrafted, good quality garments in industry. Is there a bit of a resurgence for people that are able to make stuff from home in this sort of environment?
Yes, without a doubt. I think that people are looking for a way to express individuality, and I think people are looking for clothes that last a lot longer. You'll get many people who are committing to not buying anything new. So it might be that people are looking for very well-made pre-existing clothing, and they might be changing those, upcycling, or they might be looking for clothing that is, garments that are very, very well made and have some heritage also.
Yeah. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for that, and again, thank you to Amit for submitting some of those comments there as well. Just really adding to the conversation there, which I think is absolutely wonderful. Ruth, conscious of time, so I'm gonna move on, but we'll come back to you again in just a few moments. So Ruth there was kind of talking a little bit about the impacts on things like retail. So we're going to go over to Denise, who's going to talk even more about how sort of new businesses and, as she mentioned before, entrepreneurs, how they are likely to be affected by the virus. So Denise, over to yourself.
Hi. So I think this is sort of when you have these sort of extreme environments, it sort of really helps you to sort of segregate what an entrepreneur is a bit more. So most of the time, you know, most people associate it with new venture creation. So you're starting a new business or something like that. But I think these kind of times highlight some of the other activities that they participate on, and it says participate in, and specifically it's this forward-looking activity, opportunity-seeking behavior. It's this idea of anticipating and creating the future a bit more that you tend to find. So it's the entrepreneurs who are able to adapt very quickly to these sort of short-term opportunities that are being created by COVID and COVID responses in particular. That I think who are seeming to be able to get their businesses out of these sort of the problems that you're seeing in some of the industries. I think as well, what we tend to find is in terms of predicting what the future is going to hold or anticipating that, Ruth talked about this sustainability aspect of it. And that's a big one in terms of the emergence of more what we call social entrepreneurs, or entrepreneurs who are driven by things that are not just rent seeking or profit creation, but are driven by some sort of social mission as well. So that tends to be a massive industry in the UK, creating, you know, 200 billion or so in turnover in the first place, sustainable or socially mission driven businesses. And then even more worldwide. A bigger part of that is the fact that they tend to look after the more vulnerable aspects of society or people into society. And I think that's going to be even more important. People who have that vision to create some sort of future business or pivot their business in that direction, especially when we see larger forces in the environment looking at more internally focusing activities in governments as part of their recovery packages. So, you know, some of them are promoting whether or not factories might be returned home rather than working collaboratively. We see a slowdown in globalization, or what they call slowbalization as well. So that's going to have an impact. And I think that then creates a space for organizations and socially driven organizations and social entrepreneurs to take care of some of the biggest problems that we'll see for the future, and that we might have to solve it ourselves rather than looking to the governmental institutions for the solutions. So I think that's one of the areas that we're seeing a lot of growth in. So we see things like fintech or financial technology is a big one, making certain things more accessible, or financial services more accessible to people through apps and smartphones, that sort of intersection between the two. You know, companies that are trying to serve underserved populations, such as people who, there are 3 million people on the planet with no access to the internet. We take it for granted. But we see companies like, is it OneWeb, who are launching their satellites to cover parts of the world to provide satellite-based internet rather than fiber-based internet to those areas. And again, that's going to open up things like you know, online commercial platforms, etc., for different parts of the world. So you tend to find that those companies who have that sort of forward focus position, and then smaller entrepreneurs, you know, the big companies are going to create downstream activities for them. Those are the areas that you'll find new entrepreneurs and new companies emerging. I would argue as well, for those of you who are coming into university and what you're looking for, I think it's important for you to decide what is important to you, what you want to focus on, and then you can sort of tailor your studies to look into those kind of areas and those sort of forward-looking activities as well. So some of the courses that I participate in, like social entrepreneurship and innovation, or rather social innovation and entrepreneurship, you know, those are the things that we try to teach. You know, balancing profit and an actual social mission. And that's where we're going to be seeing a lot of growth in the future.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And I think something that the coronavirus has done, even just from us all kind of working from home, is how adaptable certain companies and certain businesses can be to working in these remote environments. So it's going to be very interesting as we come later on into the stream to find out your thoughts actually about that sort of adaptation of digital media and that sort of thing. But it's been very interesting to see how companies have adapted to these new and very strange working from home environments. So the follow-up question I had just here, and it's very similar to what I mentioned to Ruth, is sort of what were the biggest sectors do you think that are going to be the most affected by coronavirus?
Yeah. So I mean, obviously there's the there's the obvious ones of, oh, we can't travel, therefore there are planes on the tarmac at Heathrow. So those are the sort of obvious big ones. But I think you kind of have to look at it, and in business, look at it as a sort of a multi-layered thing. There's so many things happening in the external environment that you want to take into account and make a decision based on. So you're going to try and manage and balance all of those things out to decide. So even if you're a new entrepreneur who's starting a business, or you're an established organization, so I talked about corporate entrepreneurship earlier, and that's entrepreneurship as it exists in a large established organization. How do they stay relevant? How do they come up with innovation? Those companies in themselves, they have to start thinking in the long term of how are they going to recruit talent for their organizations. Where is that talent located? Then that's going to link into, general economic policy around immigration, Brexit, trade wars in America between America and China. That's going to take into account, quite a few factors. So I think thinking of industries that would be hardest hit, we see the big ones, aerospace, we see oil and gas, etc. But I think we have to think more broadly in terms of all industries and what are the things that might layer on in a particular industry as well.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for your insights on there as well. And I think what you mentioned there, looking at sort of things like aerospace and things like that, actually brings us on to our next guest. So thank you very much for that, Denise, and I look forward to hearing from you again very, very shortly. But again, last but certainly not least, we certainly haven't forgotten about him. So over to John. John, what's been the sort of the impact on the engineering world due to this virus? Oh, John, just make sure you unmute your mic.
Apologies for that.
There we go. That's all right.
It might be worth just looking at what engineering actually is to start with. The impact has been notable in a number of ways, but engineering is in fact a very creative art which harnesses the laws of natural sciences to solve problems. And to make life better, more for numerous people. This has been seen in the sense that once the current coronavirus pandemic started, that a number of engineering enterprises looked immediately into how can we design ventilators, PPE, how can we fill this need, and how can we do it quickly. A number of companies tried. Some didn't quite make it. Some product wasn't needed. Others couldn't be approved. Others was very successful. Similarly, there has been a move through some initiatives to get small-scale 3D printing organizations to 3D print parts of PPE equipment for frontline workers, and that included individuals working in their houses who may have access to a 3D printer locally. We might perhaps see a generation of a new cottage industry in making small numbers of parts very quickly, growing out of that as the capabilities become more apparent. So there have been a lot of immediate impact on engineering in terms of what engineers can actually do to help in dealing with the situation. Clearly, in terms of our perspective, there's been an impact to the global supply chain that will take time to resolve. It is being resolved. In the early stages, we did have some trouble getting parts out of China, but that is largely being resolved. And as a result of this, deficiencies in the supply chain and deficiencies in this have been noted, and how we deal with them is still open to debate. We are seeing comments that perhaps we might bring manufacturing closer to the point where the product is actually needed. So that might mean manufacturing comes home. To what degree, we don't know. Unfortunately, my crystal balls have clouded over. This is still a very much an unknown quantity. And as engineers, this is what we deal with. We deal with a lot of situations where we don't have access to all the variables. We have to make decisions on how we drive this forward. And this is something that engineering is good at. And so it's a perfect time, if anyone is thinking of studying engineering, now is the time to come and get involved in that. Other areas, for example, communications. We've started to see an explosion in remote working. It's been remarkably successful by and large. Bandwidth issues are notable. Some people have better success than others. So how do we get more bandwidth into areas where there is little bandwidth? 5G, for example, get greater bandwidth, mobile. How well does that work in terms of remote working? Landline internet. it's useful, and it's what a large number of us in the UK are actually using right now to work remotely. How do we roll out faster? How do we get higher speeds down copper if necessary, which is being developed. So communications is a very big growth area even before the pandemic, and will continue to be so afterwards. And let's not forget logistics. The explosion of people working from home, no longer we can't go to shops, so you buy on the internet. The stuff is still available, but the pressure on supply chains has shifted to a different area, and technology that keeps track of parcels and product actually in process are quite important to us. So there is actually an awful lot of scope in which engineering is making a contribution right now, and will continue to be flexible and interact with that and work with the changes.
Absolutely, thank you. I think something that's going to be very relevant to everyone here, as you mentioned, sort of from a comms perspective and from an internet perspective, is how companies have adapted to those. Obviously, Virgin, for instance, have had their own hiccups of recent, for instance, but then other companies have adapted through, like Netflix lowering their resolution to deal with that. So from that perspective, from a very technical perspective, I guess that's an interesting way that companies have adapted. A question that's just come through from the comments. Amit has just asked, really wants Britain to be an engineering giant again. When do you think this could happen, especially from sort of manufacturing?
When could it happen again is a difficult question to answer. Again, there are a lot of variables in there. It's a sentiment that I would certainly concur with. I would like to see manufacturing come back. There are a number of factors and plus points in doing this, and one is clearly environmental. If you're not sending product halfway across the world, you're not eating up air miles in doing so. So there is merit in bringing manufacturing home, but with it has to come the skill set. And sadly, since the 1980s, we've progressively lost a considerable amount of skills in mass manufacturing, which would take time and investment to rebuild. And this is probably a call on industry and a call on investors to actually go back and start looking at what the benefits would be in bringing it home, in creating jobs by UK-owned, UK-managed and UK-run manufacturing industry, rather than just necessarily being a point where we can make small parts for a small wing of one particular large corporation. Perhaps we need to start to look at being the centre for certain parts of manufacturing again.
Yeah, and I particularly like what you mentioned there about a lot of maybe small businesses or people working from home, developing and creating their own things. I can see there from your background, you're obviously somebody who's a bit of a tinkerer yourself, plenty of parts on the go. So it's interesting to see that sort of development as well, I think. Well, it's interesting to note that in the UK, a lot currently as we speak, a lot of the real innovation is actually taking place in small business and small to medium-sized businesses. There is large company footprint within the UK, but strangely enough, even them by and large contract out a lot of the R&D to smaller enterprises. Not a huge amount is done in-house. So it has to be said, I think the future in R&D, on the R&D side of things, which is firmly where my background is, will be with smaller businesses, and could easily be brought home if the will was there. We could do it. Yeah, and I mean, I can speak from some experience. My father is a product engineer, and he does a lot of that he works from home, his business running from home, so he's got that kind of background. But same again, I spoke to somebody the other day who said that they were learning to rebuild a clock. So there's almost that extra time that people can invest if they want it, even just from a hobby perspective, I suppose. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
So just a follow-up question for yourself then, in terms of how we're looking at the engineering world as a whole, and you covered quite a lot of different areas there, but do you think we'll see even more sort of global collaborations as a result of this sort of maybe from working from home environment, if that continues to carry on, but just generally from the virus?
There will be a change. Exactly what form that change will take is difficult to. I'd have to be able to divine to come up with an answer to that. What humanity seems to have an ability to do is to be quite resilient, even in the face of quite significant changes. And for example, we could find that, let's just say, for example, the coronavirus pandemic died out. We could find that in a couple of years, not a lot would have necessarily changed. We might find that lessons have been learned and that there is a shift in the way we do things. I think there has to be a point where we stand up and say, actually, yes, we have found that certain things work. One thing, for example, is home working does work. It can be done for certain industries. Even R&D, there's a lot you can do with a home lab. And so if we start recognizing that, we've got to take an awful lot of cars off the road. And that would be a step forward.
Yeah, and we're already seeing that impact from an environmental standpoint as well, obviously. So yeah, no, that's really, really interesting stuff. Thank you so much, and thank you very much for looking at that from engineering from all perspectives there as well as obviously your own expertise. It's absolutely fantastic to hear from your insight on that. So thank you. I'm just going to bring everybody else back into the room so that we can carry on this discussion. Thank you so much, everybody that sort of contributed that, and thank you so much for all of your comments, for those of you that are watching, and for asking our again, stars of the show, asking them all the questions about their sort of fields of expertise. It's all very, very useful. So the next part of this sort of live stream looks at, again, how we feel like the future is going to look over the next coming months and potentially into the future in coming years. John, you just mentioned about how obviously working from home does work. Again, we've managed to do that for the last few months as a university. How is that future going to carry on, and how is that for your particular industries? Will the world return to normal, or will there be an impact? Will there be a change overall to how these different industries work? John, I'd like to just come to you first of all very quickly, just to carry on touching on that for a second, and then we'll jump over to somebody else in a second.
Oh, it's an interesting point, because I think one of the factors that would have to be looked at in combination with this is the environmental issues that we're seeing, particularly in terms of transport. And if you take the pandemic on top of that, you've got several drivers to actually induce change in certain areas. And we're already seeing calls for change, even with local councils putting temporary cycle lanes in place. Who knows how many of them will end up being permanent. But the possibility there in terms of the industry is what will happen, I think, with manufacturing and research and development. Will it come close to home? I would very much like to see that happen. But would that necessarily impact collaboration globally? Probably not. There are skill sets that are disseminated across the world, and in certain industries, with the complexity of certain products that we have in use today, that necessitates a large variety, a large diverse skill set, a diverse skill base. So, for example, design of, let's just say, for the sake of argument, passenger aircraft isn't something that would necessarily end up being centered in one place. Airbus and Boeing are pretty much spread throughout the world, certainly Airbus. And so we would see changes to the way in which these things happen, in some areas more so than others.
Lovely. So same question again for yourself, Maitre. What do you think the future holds for your sort of area of expertise?
So I think very much reflecting on what John said earlier about how, to a certain extent we can work from home. There's a lot of research that goes on sort of in silico, so looking at potential drug targets that people can work on with access to a computer, which, you don't need to be in a particular place to kind of get started on this. But obviously this is something that will need to be tested in a lab and that kind of thing. One thing that I would like to see a change in is the continuation, or something that's changed now that I would like to see continuing after we go back to normal, as it were, is this increased collaboration. It's hard to say how much that will continue, because obviously the pharmaceutical industry and academic research is very competitive, but certainly in academic research, there is a drive to move towards more open access publishing and sort of open access data. And I really hope that sort of thing continues after the pandemic as well.
Absolutely. Denisha, your sort of thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think we come from, being in academia, we do have quite a collaborative approach to certain things. I think what we tend to find a bit more in industry is, we have to consider issues around intellectual property, etc. And as such, you might find, yes, open access sharing It's becoming bigger in it's more useful in driving the R&D needing in the pharmaceutical industry at the moment. But I'm not sure if other industries are necessarily participating in that sharing aspect that much, especially, if you consider, industries returning home, there's going to be even more sort of built up secrecy around various things or protecting your sort of knowledge base in a particular way. So unfortunately, that is the nature of some aspects of business anyway. That might be something that, even though after, this particular crisis where we've all come together, might quite easily sort of fade away in some of those areas. Not to be a negative Nelly, but a bit more of a, this is kind of how it goes kind of perspective.
Absolutely. Do you feel businesses will return to completely the way they were, or do you think there will be an impact on the way people work?
I think there's definitely going to be an impact, especially around the home working aspect, mainly because even if the business did want to return that way, I suspect this is the kind of thing that most employees would push back about, just in terms of the quality of life. I live in Nottingham, and obviously work in Leicester, so I have to say I do not miss the commute. So for me, it's great. But then again, I work in, again, a sort of knowledge-based, industry where, yes, I finished my teaching luckily before it all kicked off. So I've been able to focus on writing papers and research impacts. I've been writing funding bids that are COVID related, etc. So that's been, so that's one of the benefits for myself. Some industries, unfortunately, you can't get away from that. You do have to be present to do it. I think, if I thought about this 10 years in the future where automation was even more, or 2025 even, where automation is expected to replace significant portions of manufacturing jobs, etc., I think that might be a more of a different scenario where those jobs may not have been impacted because people would have diversified into some other areas.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Finally, over to Ruth. Again, similar sort of question for your sort of industries. What do you think the future sort of holds?
Hi. Well, I think that it's going to accelerate the direction that the industry was going in anyway, particularly around ideas of sustainable design. I think it's really interesting the way that all four of us are seeing quite similar impacts in our areas, and I think this also speaks a lot to the appetite for collaboration that's going to continue as well.
Lovely, thank you. And do you feel that, and again, a similar question to what I asked Anisha, do you feel that there will be a return to normal generally across the board, or will there be an impact?
I don't think there's an appetite for returning to normal. I think that people have seen that design skills are those that are essential in many areas of the economy and leisure. And I think what we're going to see is a clear demonstration of those skills, and we're going to see employers opening up to wanting design graduates because of their design thinking abilities in areas that are outside the discipline. So lots of really positive things to take from these changes.
That's amazing, thank you. Does anybody else have anything they want to sort of add to this particular topic, looking at where the future holds for different industries, or if we sort of covered everything?
Can I add a little bit about pharmacy as well? So
of course.
Pharmacies, kind of just what Ruth said, sort of followed on with that, is that I'm not sure how much of it would go back or would want to go back to normal in some sense, because during the crisis, the pharmacies really have come into the front line and providing access to patients or providing care to patients that they cannot get in hospital or via GPs, just because the NHS has been overwhelmed with COVID-19. And I think that is something that the pharmacies want to be involved in. So pharmacies and pharmacy students and the pharmaceutical general practice has really tried to push forward the role of pharmacies in community healthcare as much bigger than what it is being utilized at the moment. So I think we can learn some lessons from this and how much bigger role pharmacies can play in society in general as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Anybody else want to add anything to that? No, I think we're all good. I always have to make sure, because obviously there's always a little bit of latency, a little bit of a delay. We have just had a question, because there was quite a lot of conversation around their sort of research and development, particularly from somebody on YouTube that said, with the acceleration of R&D, does this mean more jobs will be created out of this?
I think eventually, in the sense that R&D does require you to invest significant amounts of funding in the first place. So that's where the capital would initially go in the organization. As the results of those R&D efforts are realized in terms of how you commercialize them, what path they're going to be able to, what revenue streams they're going to be able to produce, and how you build those business models around it, then you will start to see the jobs being created around those things in particular. So it's a little bit of a delay, and will be part of that recovery period that you would see between now, where it's the sort of T0, well, I suppose, T0 in terms of, we're in crisis mode, 2 years before we start to recover.
Okay. Anybody else have anything they want to pitch on that?
It's an interesting. Will the acceleration of R&D, does it mean more jobs will be created? The short answer is yes, but there is a latency period. R&D is an interesting area, particularly in engineering, in the sense that we are starting from a point. We want to get to point Y, which is sometime in the distance. It takes a certain amount of skill to get there, and it's not something that can be done in immediately, in the sense that you couldn't necessarily just 1 minute drop a bunch of engineers in there and hope that you'd get there. It doesn't quite work like that. There is a certain amount of time for trials, testing, and then essentially productization of whatever might be the outcome of the R&D. So the time really is now. If you're in a position where you're thinking of a discipline to enter, and engineering is appealing to you, now is the time to study. We have quite a fast turnaround, that having been said. I mean, our discipline changes on a 6-monthly cycle on average. There are new innovations. So it really is, now is the time to study. And instead of thinking about what you might be able to do now, look at what contribution you might be able to make in 3 years' time when you graduate.
I would argue similarly in business, it's the same thing with our sort of module suite in terms of deciding, well, what's going to happen. So if you're running a program, you're going to think to yourself, well, what do students need to know in 2 years' time, in 3 years' time? So like you say, as R&D develops, they come up with some new products that need to be marketed or sold or integrated into, into the world in some new way. When you think of things in the fourth revolution and this idea of technology interacting with humans and biological physical spaces, you think you might need more people in that kind of space. I think also it's going to require a workforce who is very self-managing and internally motivated. Being locked inside for 2 months, I thought I was, generally, but for some reason, Wednesdays are hard. I don't know why. So it's a good thing this was on a Thursday. That in itself is going to require us as people to do even some, internal introspection on who am I as a person? Is working from home really the best thing for me? And don't just say, oh yeah, I don't have to commute. So that kind of thing, it goes a bit longer in terms of what subjects you're going to choose, the type of person you are, why you're choosing that. And that's going to, impact as well in terms of talent and recruitment practices and organizations as well. They're not going to pick the person who's like, oh, I don't work well by myself, or, and that kind of thing, or, consistency or whatever it is. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Does anybody have anything they want to add to the R&D question, or are we okay to move on? I think we're okay.
Just one. It's just a point that's always worth making. If you're again aimed really at those who are interested in perhaps pursuing a career in engineering, always follow your interests. Follow where your passion lies. Follow where your heart is leading you. Don't look at the job market and be driven by that, because by the time you qualify, the job market will change. Always follow that little something that makes you want to get out of bed and go to work on Monday morning.
Absolutely. I think that's good advice for anyone, really. The question that I've just suddenly had from that conversation that we've had there is, do you feel like this is going to change not necessarily how we teach university courses, but the actual topics itself? And Denise, you touched a little bit on that, but do you think that's going to impact somebody like yourself, Ruth, in your sort of departments? Do you feel that's going to have an impact on that?
Yes, without a doubt, because we're going to be teaching a very blended way of learning, and we'll be encouraging more reflection, and also for our students to be more outward looking. I couldn't agree more with what John was saying about people following their interests. That curiosity that you have from your interests and developing them will propel you to greater heights, without a doubt. But I think that we would want to be recognizing that the discipline boundaries are going to be broken down by as a result of everyone coming through this, the sense of community that people have, the collaboration that we've all touched on in terms of our disciplines. And I think that what will happen is that we will be equipping our students to be not only expert in their chosen field, but also very skilled in being able to adapt, be resilient, and use their ingenuity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does anybody else have any sort of thoughts on that?
In terms of health and life sciences, obviously this is going to have a huge impact on what we teach, and we're already, incorporating the virus and the pandemic and the sort of treatment options towards it into our what we teach, our syllabus, because it's something that obviously, for example, as a pharmacy student, you will have to deal with when you graduate, and even for example, a biomedical sciences student or pharmaceutical industry student, we expect that this will obviously have an impact on what sort of research you go into, or what sort of work you go into. And COVID-19 is not the first and certainly not the last emerging virus that will jump into humans. So it's definitely going to have an impact on health and life sciences.
Absolutely. That's going to be a very interesting module for the healthcare students that are going to be joining us over the next couple of years, I imagine, as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Any other thoughts before we sort of move on? Perfect. Good stuff. So last couple of questions then. So I am conscious of time, wrapping up this within sort of an hour or so. Maitreya, the question that we've had from the teams that we sort of set up beforehand is we get this question quite a lot, and we see this question floating around quite a lot, is does wearing a mask actually help with the virus?
Short answer is it depends. Mm-hmm. Tending towards a yes. I wrote an article that is on the DMU News website, actually, which will elaborate on this. But essentially, what a mask is doing is stopping or minimizing respiratory droplets that someone might cough or sneeze, release when they cough or sneeze, and that contains the infectious virus. So a mask is going to sort of minimize the transmission via these routes. So masks are helpful not for the person wearing the mask necessarily, but for people around them to stop spreading infection. But a mask on its own obviously is not going to have all the impact. It's not the be all and end all of reducing transmission. So it's really important to use a mask in conjunction with all the other social distancing aspects. So keeping distance, washing your hands, not touching your face, wearing masks properly as well. That's also really important. So it's something that should be part of the public health message, I think, but it's on its own, it's not going to stop transmission.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. The next question we had was for Ruth, and it was talking a little bit about what's going to happen to something called fast fashion. So Ruth, over to yourself.
Yeah, well, fast fashion is essentially it's a very quick turnover of goods, particularly clothing, that in the shops for a very short period of time, and the idea is to encourage you to spend more. They're manufactured under pretty awful conditions usually, and are very inexpensive. We know that people on average are spending 60% more on clothing than they were 20 years ago, and they keep them for half the amount of time. Fast fashion is under the microscope following COVID-19. The whole supply chain from design, production, manufacture and consumption is under the microscope being examined, and my feeling is it's over.
Okay, wow, that's very interesting. And obviously with fast fashion, does that incorporate things like online fashion shopping and that sort of thing as well?
There are some good online practices and there are some poor online practices. I won't be drawn on which ones are which, but for example, I think it's more to do with consumer practices, really, because we all know that if a t-shirt costs £1, then it's not necessarily made in the best conditions. But we have this online purchasing, something called bracketing, where because you can't try on the clothes, you're able to buy several sizes, try them on, see which one fits you, and return them at no additional cost. So this has become a fast fashion online shopping model. Unfortunately, it's been shown that it's much more economically efficient for those businesses to not put the returned items back into circulation, but to actually shred them. So I think that people are looking at their consumer practices and their choices, their values, and we are going to see some big changes.
I think that sounds really positive from there. Thank you very much. Again, I'm sort of getting through these questions quite quickly because, I am sort of conscious of time. So, Denise, a question for yourself is: how will COVID-19 change global business climate for entrepreneurs?
I think there's some positives and some negatives to it. Obviously, I think in this sort of crisis mode, we're seeing lots of changes in terms of how businesses are operating and how they're willing to operate and realizing, okay, I can do this in a different way. So that might disrupt certain mindsets around how you would traditionally run your business. And, at the same time, that's going to challenge some of the more traditional business models. So it's a case of whether or not you as an organization can start to think a little bit differently, looking at, whether or not we have space for some of the larger innovations. So I would say this is a time we would see more of what we would call creative destruction, where you come up with some new way of doing things that's going to sort of eliminate the old way of doing things, rather than some of the smaller incremental changes. So I think for an entrepreneur trying to move into this new era, uncertainty and your ability to manage uncertainty, not be thrown by it, then your ability to manage and calculate risk with so many different things happening around you, that's going to be the sort of skill set that you'll need to develop and hone in this new time. So I think, more uncertainty, more risk for entrepreneurs, but at the same time, it does create a certain amount of opportunity as well. And it's your ability to properly define that opportunity and understand how you're going to exploit that opportunity, given certain parameters, be it around things like sustainability, whether or not your consumers do value, better conditions for where their things are coming from and what they want from their products. So there's a bit of that as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much for answering that question. Finally, we go over to John for our final question of the live stream. John, the question was, how will COVID-19 impact on UK engineering, which obviously we've already talked about, and do you think there will be an increased adoption of automation and digital tools, which again, I think you mentioned earlier, just to reflect on that?
I think, yes, there will be an increased adoption of automation. Certainly there will be an increased use of digital tools. Not that that wasn't in the pipeline before the pandemic struck. There's a lot of innovation and movement in manufacturing to automate certain processes more strongly. How will COVID-19 impact? Well, that's going to depend very much on how long the current situation lasts for. The longer, the more likely it is to have an impact. And that's largely a factor of the latencies involved in making innovation in these areas and then actually rolling that innovation out into the manufacturing industries themselves. I think we'll probably see an increased use of, well, digital tools is a very broad term, but certainly in terms of communication, and I refer back to the obvious one that we all see of home working, we'll probably start to see an increase in the use of digital facilities and digital mechanisms for monitoring, remote monitoring of manufacturing, remote monitoring of even certain things happening in research areas, in research laboratories, and also for communication. So it's likely that the digital side of things will take off probably before we see a noticeable increase in automation. But then that's all subject to change. And again, it's a very fluid situation, which we haven't been in, certainly not in my lifetime.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, John. Again, just giving your insight there. And thank you to everyone that have provided your sort of expertise and insight in your various disciplines to people watching. It's been very informative, even for myself, as somebody that is not ingrained within engineering or business or fashion or pharmacy. It's been very informative for me to learn a lot more about how these industries are sort of developing and coping with the virus. I'm afraid we are going to have to leave the live stream there because it has we've hit time, and I'm sure we're all very, very busy people that have got other things to do working from home. That doesn't include, obviously, commuting from work, though, which is always a nice benefit of this, isn't it? So, yes, thank you so much for your contributions today on the live stream. And again, thank you so much to everybody in the comments that have been sort of following along, asking questions of our wonderful academics here at the university. You can find out a lot more about the courses here at De Montfort University, obviously through our website and through the virtual open day that we are going to be running on the 4th of July. What I have done for everybody watching is I've popped a link to the open day there in the comments, so you can follow that through there, and it's obviously there on screen. So if you come along to that, a lot of our academics will be available to have a chat with. You can find out a little bit more about the courses. Again, there are lots and lots to see and lots on offer there, so do make sure you follow through on that if you are interested in any of our courses. Again, you can connect with current students through our Facebook group. So if you are actually in our Facebook group watching this live stream at the minute, hello. But obviously, if you are watching and you would like to join that group and actually maybe even carry this conversation on there, you can do so through that Facebook group. And again, I've popped that link in the comments. But yes, there are more live streams going on, which again, you can find through the De Montfort University website. So keep an eye out for those. And I hope you enjoyed today's session. Again, thank you so much to you guys, and thank you so much for watching. Obviously, stay safe. Control the virus as the tagline will go, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your week, and we hope you enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you all at the next one. Thank you very much. Take care.
Bye.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.